the History with Jackson podcast. Welcome back to History with Jackson. I'm your host, Jackson Van Uden, and you are listening to the podcast where we speak to historians every week about their latest work. Now, if you enjoy this episode or any other episodes that we create here, please do consider heading to our Patreon or History Jackson Plus on Apple Podcasts, where you can get your episodes ad-free and a week early. Now, without further ado, let's jump into the episode. So hello and welcome back to the History of Jackson podcast, and today we're joined by author, historian, and very good friend, Dr. Steve Tibble. How you doing, Steve?
Oh, very well, Jackson. All the better for seeing you there, looking beardy and wonderful as ever. So.
Oh, stop it.
Ooh.
And I love having you back on the podcast.
Oh, well, me too, darling.
And today we're talking about a super awesome book, your brand new one, Assassins and Templars, A Battle in Myth and Blood. It's great cover, great story. But what made you want to write this book? Because previously you've written about Crusader strategy, Crusader armies, the Templars, Crusader criminals. What led to this one?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's typical assassin stuff. It just sprang out at me, just when you least expect it. It's no, I'd like to be able to pretend that I'm kind of an evil marketing genius and I was hanging on the coattails of Assassin's Creed, the video game, which is obviously great. And but the sad reality is very different. I'm not an evil marketing genius. More's the pity, It actually came out with two of the books you mentioned. So I wrote two books for Yale, who are lovely publishers, very supportive, do beautiful books, actually, beautiful covers as well. And I was doing this book on the Templars. And as usual, I was overwriting a little bit. But also, I was coming across a lot of stories of Templars doing crazy things with the assassins in Syria. But because the book about the Templars was focusing on Britain, I couldn't definitively prove that there were Brits doing it, though in fact I think there almost certainly were. But it did mean, but I couldn't help myself from writing it, because I don't know about you, I love writing, and I just write these kind of like little scrapbook things that I keep in my back pocket. So I had this kind of file of stories between the assassins and the Templars, and then I started to write a book called Crusader Criminals, again for Yale, and it was a hilarious book to write because it's all the crazy true crime stuff of the Crusades, stuff that's great fun at a distance of 1,000 years, that sort of horrible stuff in real life. But from a distance, it's hilarious. You get pirates, murderers, bandits. And within 2 minutes of writing about murder and the Crusades, you come up against the assassins. So again, me being me, I'd sort of kind of overwritten it. And I was fascinated with the assassins and how they developed this methodology, the very, very unique methodology of political power, really. It's how do we sort of, make enemies and influence people. But I couldn't put it in the book because the more I thought about it, they didn't really classify as criminals. They were not murdering people for fun. This is not, it was not murder for, for robbery. It wasn't murder of passion. It was clinical. It was political murder. So I had to take out a huge amount of that as well. But it did mean that I had a wealth of stories in the back of my head that I couldn't use in either of those books. And eventually I thought, I've got to tell this story, because effectively, even though I'm not an evil marketing genius, an EMG, it is the backstory of Assassin's Creed. And I was kind of shocked when you put it all together to see just how rich that backstory is. There's a lot of truth there. Obviously, the game doesn't pretend to be a history lecture, and it's a fantasy sci-fi game, but it does have an authentic historical feel to it, and it does actually have a lot of characters who in real life did bounce off each other. So this is my attempt to try and bring their story to life, really.
Now, it's been really cool, like sitting with you as you've been writing this book and hearing these kind of stories. But I think one of the few things that we kind of think about when we think about assassins is we think about these like stealthy individuals running around, acting on their own, really. But now you're saying that they're an organization who are working with a wider agenda. So within the context of the Crusades, who are the assassins and how are they kind of organized?
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. I mean, there's so much mythology about the Templars and the Assassins. Yeah, these were both groups who thrived off their mystique. They were legends in their own lifetime, and that's just got bigger over time. Almost the first thing I wanted to do was to try and peel back the layers of mythology and get back to the truth, because in both cases, the truth is so extraordinary. You don't need to make stuff up. It's just fantastic. So the Assassins, basically, you can picture them almost as an oppressed religious minority. That's certainly how they saw themselves. So they were, technically, you'd call them Nizari Ismailis. And the Nizari Ismailis are a sect that broke away from, or a subset of the broader Ismaili movement, such as the Fatimids in Egypt. There were a big Fatimid empire in Egypt in the 11th and 12th centuries, who were Ismailis. And the Ismailis are, in turn, a break away from broader Shiite religion. So they're a Shiite sect. Obviously, Shia is a subset of Islam. So it meant that they were, in the traditional way, they were a little bit extreme. I think it's fair to say. I don't want to denigrate them, but they were a fairly extreme religious sect. Even in their own, other Ismailis didn't always get on with them. There was a lot of friction, a lot of murders going on between them and the Fatimids in Egypt. But where they really had problems was how they interacted with their Muslim neighbours, because most of them were Sunni. They were Sunni Turks, or in the case of Saladin, Sunni Kurds, who viewed them as heretics. So you had this tiny religious minority who, because they're seen as heretics, are almost inherently just about, they're oppressed, they're waiting to be wiped out. And it does explain some of the, it's quite odd to think, well, why are you writing a book about the Assassins and the Templars? Because obviously the Templars, very good Christians, very extreme, arguably, Catholic sect. Surely they hate each other, and they do some of the time. But actually, the Assassins have less grief, less of an angle to hate Christians than they do the Sunnis, because Sunni Muslims treat them as heretics, whereas Christians, by and large, are not interested in, Islamic theology. They're not interested in the minutiae of whatever. So they were often able to work with Christian groups in the Crusades, including the Templars. They were manning castles with the Crusaders, sometimes fighting on their side in battles, giving them castles. And you find even there's one instance of the leader of the Syrian Ismailis actually dying and being buried in a Crusader castle. And the garrison was so chummy with the local Ismailis that they were able to come and pray at his tomb and do pilgrimage to his tomb. So, yeah, it's a weird thing. I think, because we're European, we take a very Eurocentric view of it. And a lot of people see Assassins as being over here fighting Christians, fighting the Crusaders, and really not the truth at all. In reality, they occasionally killed Christian leaders for money or because they didn't like them or whatever, but it wasn't ever a theological dispute. Bizarrely, the Assassins were far more open-minded than most other people. Is more open-minded than the Sunni Muslims, probably a lot more open-minded than, many of the Catholic Crusaders they were dealing with. They were strangely, they were very esoteric. They were interested in philosophy. They were not what you'd think at all.
I think throughout a lot of the traditional narratives, we've been fed this idea that they're very bloodthirsty and they want to get murder done promptly. But then how come we're in how do we get to a situation where both the Christians and the Muslims in the region have turned to militaristic, heretical sects, per se? Because you've got the Templars, the Hospitallers, and other military orders arising as militaristic, monastic orders, and then you've got the Assassins being this extremist Islamic sect.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, part of it is just, Darwin. One word, Darwin. How does a small oppressed minority survive in the Middle East of the Crusades? And if you think, well, what do the winners? What do the big guys do? And what they do is they have lots of resources and they spend those resources buying in huge quantities of mercenaries. They create big armies, which are a nuisance, but they lumber around and they squash people. So the big players in this kind of SimCity Darwinistic sort of way just develop a very obvious methodology. If you're small, and super hated, you have to just be more clever than that. All the small players in the Crusades get destroyed very quickly. I mean, the Turks, just ran over nearly all the Arab states very, very quickly. They gave the Fatimids a good kicking, So it's not even about religion. It's about how does the smallest kid in the playground keep his lunch money, really? And the assassins, instinctively, because they were super strategic, really, worked out that they couldn't have an army of 10,000 cavalry. But what they could do is have one super determined guy with a dagger who was committed to kill the enemy and would not, they would stay there for 10 years. If it took 10 years, they would do it. And they had a promise. They developed a promise of death, which was their real leverage. And if you think any brand, if you go into McDonald's or Pret-a-Manger or any brand you can think of, what you're buying into is a promise. You go there on the understanding that you sort of know what you're going to get and they're going to deliver and so on. And that the assassins had this just instinctive understanding of what branding was, and they developed this mystique and this brand almost totally focused around death. And it was through that kind of rifle shot. They were the snipers of the Middle East at a time when everybody else had tanks and shotguns. These were the snipers, and they knew that the only way they could survive was by being more clever. I think an important part of the methodology as well, and one thing they've got in common with the Templars, is that they understood the difference between a corporation and a family-run business. Most of the big players were family-run businesses. So if you're a Turkic warlord, you've got your cities, you've got your territory, but you've also got, a son that you love, you've got your wife, you've got you've got a family, and it's very fragile. You may have an army of 10,000 cavalrymen, but if somebody is going to kill your wife or kill you or kill your heir, you're in real trouble. That puts real fear into you. Whereas a corporation like the Assassins, they've got their own leadership structures, the old man of the mountain, as they came to be called, and the Templars have their master. But if you kill the master of the Templars or the old man of the mountain, there'll be another one on Tuesday, and he'll probably be even more pissed off than the one you've just killed. There's no leverage over a corporation through an individual death. Individual death can really get to the heart of how you can manipulate a large family-run business. Whereas for them, they were completely impervious. They might be relatively small in numbers, but a single death was not going to cripple them. They needed to be stomped on properly to be killed. So it was that funny trade-off, and a really interesting methodology.
And I want to dive into that corporation analogy that you used. You've used that for the Templars quite a lot in the past. But then how is it manifesting within the Assassins? Are they selling this service of assassination and death to other leaders? And are they kind of establishing an area which is theirs for them to make money off? Because I'm assuming that the opportunity for political murder is one that doesn't swing round quite as often as one would imagine.
No, you're right. You've summed up a lot of their key issues there, really. I mean, so if you think about it, they're a small heretical sect. And the Middle East, the Holy Land in particular, is very crowded. So they need to carve out a place to live. And the kind of place that an oppressed minority could live is on top of a mountain, in a castle. And there are two problems with that. I mean, well, three really. A, it's crowded, so it's difficult to carve out that territory. B, even once you've done it, this is probably the economically least viable territory in the area. And C, you need castles, which are, unbelievably expensive to build. And we haven't got the building invoices for the Assassins, but we do for the Templars, say. And you're talking about, a small country's GDP going into building a big castle. So they've chosen the right course. It's almost the only course they can take, which is to be. It's like being that small creature with a poisoned tooth. So you're not the lion or the elephant, but you can be the adder with the sharp poison. You're absolutely right. It's not. You can't always leverage that power through murder. Obviously, sometimes you genuinely do need to make friends and influence people. So there were many occasions where, particularly in the early days, they cozied up to various Sunni leaders in Aleppo or Damascus, and they were very charismatic. Their leaders were superb as missionaries. So they'd go into these places, they'd get influence, they'd infiltrate, they'd convert a lot of people from Sunniism to their brand of Shiism. But then, as soon as their overlord died, the one who was in their pockets, there would be a massacre. So eventually they gave up doing that, and they realized the only thing they could do would be to set up their own principality, like their own kingdom in the mountains. But then you're into problems A, B, and C, all of which kind of imply that you need cash. And it's never been totally explained why they would actually do hits for money. It seems, if you think about it, why would they do hits for money? They hate the Sunnis. The Sunnis hate them. Why would they do the bidding of a Sunni overlord and then say, go and kill Conrad of Montferrat or Philip of Montfort, or and the answer often is just cash. So they ideally find someone they don't like. I think they personally didn't like Conrad of Montferrat because of some petty dispute over one of their ships. I mean, embarrassingly prosaic. They didn't like him. There's a very, very high chance that one of the local Muslim leaders, possibly Saladin, gave them a load of money to kill him. But they were probably touting for it because they were delighted to do it anyway, and it just makes sense to get somebody to pay you to do something you want to do anyway. So yeah, I wouldn't want to have been an economist. The Chancellor of the Exchequer for the Syrian assassins would have been a very difficult role, quite apart from the chances of getting murdered by your own people. Juggling those books would not have been easy, but their primary way of getting large amounts of quick cash and influence was murder.
And I assume they're selling a service there that not a lot of other organisations in the region are selling. But then you've mentioned quite a lot in your other work that the Crusades and the region are quite an ethnically diverse place, but also that the fault lines that we traditionally believe in, Muslim versus Christian, are not the fault lines that are there. So who are the assassins primarily working with? How do they fit within this?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it's a jigsaw puzzle, and it's a shifting puzzle. So I don't think the assassins have friends. They just. I forget I don't forget who said it was Palmerston or someone like that. There's Her Majesty's government doesn't have friends. It has interests. And I think very much the case with the assassins. They had interests, and they were prepared to pursue those interests in any way they needed to. So if it suited them to cozy up to the Christians, they were really happy to do that. There were at least 2 occasions where they even started talks that were interpreted as an offer to convert to Christianity. I'm dubious about what was really on the table, but they were so cozy, to King Amalric, one of the early kings of Jerusalem, that they were certainly prepared to go into a very close strategic alliance because it suited them. They disliked the Christians less than they hated their Sunni neighbours. It's very, very pragmatic. And similarly, in the 13th century, St. Louis was in very close negotiations with them, and Christian monks were able to go even into the bedroom of the old man of the mountain, look at his library, look what he was reading, which was, a lot of it was Platonistic, was non-Quranic materials, and he was quite happy to talk to them about the role of Christianity in their thought. So they were open-minded in the sense of pursuing their own interests, and I think they genuinely, at certain times, were very, very much more open-minded than some of their Christian or Muslim neighbours.
And I found that interaction between the Christians and the assassins to be really, really enlightening, because it's not something that you imagine. But then the Templars, because they've eternally locked into this conflict with the assassins through media and mythology, what's their relationship directly like with the assassins? Are they locked in this conflict that we see them, or are they being more pragmatic about it?
Yeah, ironically, I'd say the Templars are probably more emotional about it than the assassins. When there's an assassin hit, it's either it can often be mysterious, but that just means we don't know why they did it. But when you do know why they did it, there's a good reason. Sometimes it's cash money, sometimes it's political stance, often both. But with the Templars, you do find they do things that you're struggling to explain, through economics. And I think a lot of it is, they were quite edgy, emotional guys in their own way. The key to it, and you raised the very correct point that they are conjoined in our memory. They're conjoined in things like, the video game Assassin's Creed, but they're conjoined in any number of conspiracy theories down the ages. But they were bizarrely actually conjoined. I assumed that when I started this, I thought, oh, okay, well, they're in the same area, but that's probably as far as it goes. And that's not the case at all. The Templars were sucked into exactly the same area. I mean, part of the problem really is geography. It's like a cage. So you've got these two, pit fighters in the same cage. The mountains of Lebanon is where the assassins ended up, and that's where they built their castle network. But that same mountain range were also one of the very vulnerable points of the Crusader states. It was where the county of Tripoli was at risk, and it was so expensive to maintain these castles that the Council of Tripoli couldn't do it anymore. So they had basically, by the middle of the 12th century, they were handing those areas over to the military orders, and the Templars ended up, being landlords, close neighbors. It's probably the worst landlord-tenant relationship in history, and God knows we've probably all seen a few of them, but this was colossal. To the point where, we were talking about Amalric, King Amalric cozying up with the assassins, and to the point where they really had come to a deal, and there were diplomatic parties going to and from. And the Templars just thought, we don't really want that. We really hate assassins, and we like extorting money from them and giving them a good kicking. So I know what, I'll go and wipe out their diplomats as they come back from visiting the king. And they did. Even though they were under the king's protection, they just wiped them out. There was a guy led by a Templar who was probably the nearest they had to a hitman, a guy called Walter of Menil, who and he's a classic figure, one eye, scarred face, it's like a real Hollywood trope, but entirely true. And they just wiped out the assassin diplomats who were talking to the king. And as you can imagine, King Amalric was not amused. He went absolutely mental. Yeah, almost started a civil war. He was desperate to try and bring Walter Menil and his men to justice for this. Luckily for the Templars, though sadly for everybody else, King Amalric died a few weeks later while the court proceedings were going underway, and everybody else kind of hushed it up afterwards. But the Templars there was this almost irrational hatred of the assassins. But because they were these, I think there was a lot of bad blood that we just don't know about. They were in the same area. They were locked together. The Templars were Templars and the Hospitallers were the only people brave enough to extort money every year from the world's most dangerous people. I mean, it was amazing. They did, they got protection money off the assassins. And if the protection money wasn't forthcoming, they would ride in, destroy assassin villages, and give them a kicking. And yeah, so they did have this sort of horribly conjoined relationship forced on them by geography, politics, religion. And they both, again, largely by coincidence, they both came up with similar methodologies. The Templars knew that they didn't have 10,000 men, but what they could do was put the fear of God into somebody by focusing on killing them in a charge. When a Templar attacked you, you knew you were in trouble and they were coming right for your face. And when you fell out with the assassins, you knew you were in real trouble and they were going to get you from behind. So between the two of them, they came to the same answer. They're both relatively small groups of guys, and actually came up with the same kind of very logical and bloody kind of response to it.
It's quite funny how, despite the animosity, they still come to a similar answer. But then something that struck me whilst I was reading was that the Templars seem to be, as you've already said, more emotionally charged, but religion seems to play a larger part in the way they live their lives and the way they act. Meanwhile, the assassins seem to be more business-minded as the Crusades go on. Why is that?
Yeah, I think they're both very religiously minded. I mean, I think the assassins are very religious. They have their own, fairly extreme view on religion, just as the Templars do. It's partly to do with their ending. The Assassins towards the end. And funnily enough, both the Assassins and the Templars are kind of born at roughly the same period of time, and they both have their day. They both finish at pretty much the same time, and in practical terms. And the Assassins, you find they were given a really good kicking by the Mongols in Iran and pretty much wiped out there. But in Syria, they were effectively taken over eventually by the Mamluks. Because the whole leverage they had was their ability to put the fear of God into somebody. And with the Mamluks and people like Baybars, their sultan, they were just remorseless. You could not put the frighteners on Baybars. He put the frighteners on you. And so in a very relatively short period of time, from the 1260s onwards, they became his puppets, really, his creatures, and they used murder for their own purposes, but it was quite sad. It was quite reactive. They used murder to justify their own existence. So they were like the servants of the Mamluks. Even though the Mamluks, Baybars hated them, and we've got some of his correspondence that, luckily they didn't see, describing them in incredibly derogatory ways. But he knew they had skills. They had assets that he could use. So if he wanted to put the frighteners on a Crusader lordship or whatever, or a Crusader king, all he had to do was say, I want this, otherwise I'll put my assassins onto you. And sometimes he wouldn't even mention it. He would just literally put his assassins onto them. For instance, with Edward I, the Longshanks, he was a prince rather than king when he was out there in the 1270s. But Baybars set the assassins on him, and Longshanks was stabbed with a poisoned dagger by one of the assassins. Not because the assassins had anything in particular against Edward that we know of, literally nothing at all. But they were Baybars' creatures. He allowed them to exist if they did what he wanted. So in a way, it was the same job. They were protecting their community through violence, like so many communities do, really. I mean, that's in the essence of a lot of humanity's actions.
And it's not out of the ordinary for any community within the Crusades to protect their own community with violence. But then a lot of the conversation that we've had so far is primarily focusing on the way Muslim leaders, the Fatimids, the Mamluks, how they believe that the assassins are acting, and the Frankish Crusaders. But when Europeans are coming over, you've got St. Louis, you've got Richard, you've got Edward, you've got the Germans coming over as well. How are they seeing and reacting? And you mentioned Edward is the other hand of other side of an assassination attempt. How are they viewing this assassin force?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and we don't know all the details on that, and partly it's because they didn't know all the details of it. So they would be making a lot of it up as they came along. So, for instance, when German Crusaders came over, they were happy to bribe the assassins. I think there was a sum of 40,000 basants people were talking about, big sums of money, to get a kind of free pass. So they saw them as a political player. So they're someone you have to reckon with. For someone like Louis, they were interesting because they were open-minded and they were prepared to talk about religion and philosophy with him at a time when he knew just how dangerous the Mamluks were. So they were people, bizarrely, who you could talk to, that you could negotiate with. And it worked, yeah. So it worked in lots of different ways. With Richard, there have been accusations that perhaps he paid them to kill Conrad of Montferrat. I don't really believe it, because it was really no longer in his interest to do that. He kind of wanted out at that point. But the fact that those rumors were around, and they're contemporary rumors, they're not just modern conspiracies. The fact that those rumors were around showed that, again, the assassins' methodology had worked. The fact that they were a tiny group of people, and they probably had a couple of dozen very committed guys who were prepared to do these killers. So, that couple of dozen guys had this sort of magnifying effect on the power they could propel and project. They could project power through a handful of devoted followers. So it's a very clever way for a small group to protect itself and to project its own interests. So yeah, I mean, they were playing a very complicated game, and I think the Europeans struggled sometimes to see the complications. So to me, that's one of the big problems with being a crusader, a genuine crusader, as in somebody coming from Europe on crusade, is that you've got this hideous learning curve. It's a kaleidoscope of ethnicities, religions, interests when you get out there, and they're fighting differently. They're Turkic archers, you've got assassins with daggers, you've got Fatimids doing whatever. It's a crazy world. If you're coming from Dublin or somewhere like that, it's almost like science fiction when you get there. And that's one of the reasons why the military orders, why the Templars and the Hospitallers were so important, because they could effectively train the guys up. They were present in all the courts of Europe, and they were talking to the main guys who are going to be the generals. And, we don't have the training manuals other than the rule of the temple, for instance, the Templars. But you can see by their actions that the guys are arriving having had a little bit of background, so they hit the ground running in many cases. But it's a frighteningly sort of disparate group, and it's so unforgiving. You turn up to the Crusades, you get it wrong, you're dead. You can't say, oh no, sorry, I got that wrong, I'll start again. It's too late for that, chum. It's all over.
And it's always been very interesting listening to the struggles that Europeans have in terms of, well, I can't fight this way, I can't charge at people this way. That group is absolutely terrifying, and I'm not going to war with them again. So I completely understand how that mystique of the assassins kind of is something that is difficult to comprehend and difficult to understand. Assassins go to be the servants of the Mamluks, but the Templars' PR seems to fail dramatically, where the assassins seem to adapt to allow themselves to survive. So why is it that the Templars aren't adapting to survive?
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, they both leave the stage very similar times, and arguably, they both leave the stage. So you could argue, well, it doesn't really matter. They're both lost, and in a sense, they did both lose. I think you can make a good case for both of them. As in, they tried very hard and they did a lot better than you could expect. But, by the end of the 13th century, they were both pretty wasted. The Crusaders had been chucked out of the Holy Land. That was the Templars' one job, was to defend the Holy Land. And the last Europeans left in 1291 from Acre. Clearly they didn't, they lost that. And the assassins had been wiped out in Iran, and they'd been neutered in Syria. They controlled no towns or cities, so you could argue that they both failed in roughly about the same time. The reason that the assassins at least had a kind of an afterlife in Syria was because they were flexible, and they had the common sense to give Baibars what he wanted and his successors what they wanted, which was hired hands. And then, funnily enough, I mean, the bizarre thing is that they actually became in reality what the mythology makes them now. There is this kind of legend now that of the assassins as being hired hands, and the word assassin has morphed into that meaning. In reality, they morphed into that meaning themselves. They went from being religious zealots who used murder to defend their community into being murderers for hire. I mean, for the same ultimate goal, they were only doing it to protect their community, but they ironically did mimic the current legend. They were flexible. I think the key thing is they were flexible enough to make that change. The Templars, on the other hand, were not very flexible. They had a leader in, Jacques de Molay, who was not very flexible. When the order was closed down when the arrest took place in 1307 and it was eventually closed down, he had no real flexibility. After 1291, there was a lot of talk of the Templars and the Hospitallers being merged so they could operate together more efficiently. There was a lot of talk of people adopting different roles. Like the Templars carried on with their hospital work. They started running ships and, taking over a place like Rhodes so they could, try and defend the Eastern Mediterranean. The Templars were so inflexible. They just said, okay, well, give us an army of 50,000 men, and we'll go back and take the Middle East. And it's like, well, A, that won't work because we've tried that, and B, you don't have any support for that. So they were kind of redundant, and it was that sad case where you get someone who's redundant, and their only response is to say, "Give me my job back." That was it. They painted themselves into a corner. So when they were closed down by the French monarchy, it was And, they were trumped up charges. They were almost entirely false charges. But they sort of created their own problem. They were quite arrogant. They weren't always easy to work with. And they were very inflexible, so they made themselves redundant, really. And the assassins, let's not forget, they were probably appalling to deal with as well. You had to be so careful. But at least they had the flexibility in them at the end to make the shift to protect their community.
And I can certainly understand how there was that growing frustration towards the Templars from European monarchies, nobles, papacy, and then a very broke French king. So I completely understand that kind of stress. So how come then we get to the 21st century and we have this mythology and these particular images of the Templars and assassins, these assassins being lone warriors, assassinating people for political gain, and the Templars being co-opted for nationalist imagery, but also being seen as this evil entity as well.
Yeah, no, I know. I mean, both groups lend themselves to modern conspiracies incredibly well, and they've got partly themselves to blame. They thrived. They were legends in their own lunchtimes when they were alive. So they thrived on their own mystique, and that mystique was fundamentally based on murder, death, and to an extent extremism, and some level of secrecy that might go with that. So they're a perfect sort of blank page in some ways to start writing on. In the case of the Templars, they're a particularly good blank page because all their records got lost at the end of the Crusades. So you can literally make up anything you want. Their competitors are Hospitallers, who were very similar. Their records have survived, and they're so dull. I mean, amazingly boring. You would not make up stories about the Holy Grail and that kind of stuff with the Hospitallers because they've got building invoices, mortgages, the size of water pipes. It's unbelievably dull stuff. Whereas the Templars, you can, in your head, you can just go, wow, I can, Nazi moon bases, sharks, anything you want. Discovering America, you can make it all up and pin it on them. And if you take that, combined with the fact that the Assassins and the Templars were so cool. They were super cool in their own day, and they have a lot of kind of enduring qualities that some people, not necessarily me, find attractive. They were both the kind of James Bond of their day. And, they were both butch. They were incredibly focused and fanatical. So you can see, for instance, why the Freemasons would want to buy into that whole backstory by creating links to the Templars, particularly given that they were closed down with this whole sort of idea of magic and sorcery hanging over them as well. It's not true, but it it makes for a good story. And the same with the Assassins. They are genuinely were larger than life, and they've that whole mystique has just carried on. They were very, very secretive as well. That's one of the difficult things about writing the book is that you don't find the volume of chronicles and autobiographies or whatever that you might find for other groups. There's enough to do it, but you often end up interpreting their actions through chronicles written by their enemies. So you have to be very careful how you do it, which is part of the fun, part of the challenge. But again, it's another thing that you can use them as a tabula rasa for your own conspiracies. And they both lend themselves to it. You can see why Assassin's Creed has got them as the two main groups. They're both fabulous, violent, dangerous, scary, super cool. It's like, you name it, they've got it. So yeah, not surprised at all, really.
So with that in mind, them being super cool and violent and just the James Bonds of the day, for our final fun question then, Steve, what was your favourite assassination that you found out about when you were writing this book?
My favourite assassination? Oh, gosh, that's a good one. I mean, you shouldn't have a favourite assassination, should you, really? But if I did, I think Philip of Montfort, when they killed him, there was a Frankish lord who was killed, I think it was 1270. And there was a team of two assassins inveigled their way into his household, and then they split. One went off with his, I think, son-in-law. The other one stayed with him. Everybody is so incompetent. It's lovely because I like it occasionally when you kind of get a pinprick that bursts this whole image. So when you find that the Templars can actually just be a bit naughty and a bit rubbish, like they're stealing money and then they're not even very good at stealing money, that kind of thing. And there's one particular assassination, so the assassination of Philip of Montfort. The assassin becomes a Turcopole, so he's like a cavalry officer, I guess, a junior cavalry officer, and he's persuaded Philip to let him into his household. So he waits until a Sunday morning, and Philip's unarmed. Philip's son is in the chapel in their castle with just one knight who's also unarmed, and the assassin, who's got a poisoned dagger, attacks this unarmed old bloke. And then even that nearly goes wrong. He stabs the old guy, and I think I always see the old guy as being a bit like Prince Charles. He's got this kind of funny habit of messing with his jacket or whatever. And so the knife goes through his hand and nearly doesn't kill him because he's messing with his ring finger. But Philip eventually does die. And while that's happening, while he's bleeding out on the floor, the assassin runs over to the chapel where there are these two unarmed guys, both surprised, I imagine frightened, I would be, and they're saying mass. Just, we don't even know if there was a priest there. It sounds like there's just two of them in the chapel. And the assassin again can't kill them. He runs up, and they play this. It's like a kids' game, really, or where he's basically chasing them around the altar. It's like Benny Hill. So he's running around the altar with the dagger. Eventually, he gets bored, and he's got a sword as well. And there's a painted altarpiece that they're running around, and he throws his sword at the Philip's son, and he misses. So he just goes into the altarpiece. So obviously, it's tragic for art historians, but good news for the son. So then they carry on running around again, and eventually, I think they'll just get bored in submission. And the guy who's with Philip's son manages to grab the assassin, even though he's got a sword, had a sword, and he's got a dagger, and unarmed, grapples him to the ground. And he shouts to the son to come over and kill him. And the son then messes it up, and he picks up the guy's dagger, stabs himself by accident, and then eventually they manage to stab the guy. It's just, everybody is just so incompetent. I love it because it makes me feel good about myself, because I know I'd be rubbish at doing it. So it's just nice to see that even these sort of Crusader knights and assassins, they can be incredibly rubbish when it comes to it. Yes. Yeah. Little, it's humanizing.
I think that's a great story, and if the pros can mess it up, we're fine. We can do it.
Yeah, exactly. That gets us off the hook, doesn't it?
Now, obviously, Steve, we've spoken about a small portion of Assassins and Templars. So where can people get a copy if they want to learn more?
Local bookshops, it's out there. Amazon, Yale University Press website. It's all there, darling. If you want it, you can get it. So yeah, it's a very, very gorgeously produced book, I have to say.
And they always smash the covers. The covers are always brilliant.
I know, and I know it's gorgeous. And I can say that because I had no role in it at all. They don't let me have any choice in the matter because they know I'm rubbish and not creative. And what they come up with is fantastic. So yeah, it's all good.
And then if people want to interact with you more and follow you online, where can they go?
I've got a website. Because Tibble is such a silly name, I've got stevetibble.com. And fairly easy to get, strangely. So you can see what I'm up to on stevetibble.com. I'm on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn. So yeah, and again, Steve Tibble is pretty sad, silly name. So I'm easy to find if you want me.
So I'll make sure they're all in the description below so people can keep up to date with you because you've got some great work coming out on all of them. But thank you very much for coming on, Steve.
Thank you, darling. You're very kind. Lovely talking to you.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The History with Jackson podcast.